Chapter 1. The soft, blurred light of dawn. A small, lonely island at the mouth of a sheer-sided fjord. A sparkle pierces the muffling sea fret. The flat clang of steel on steel troubles the eerie silence. A small boat bobs at the water's edge. 2 sets of footprints in the sand lead up the beach towards the thin grass. 2 men stand facing each other, catching their breath by unspoken mutual consent. Both are exhausted, their hair spiked with sweat. One, gripping a sword, peers nervously over the rim of a hacked and splintered shield. The other leans heavily on the shaft of an axe. Simultaneously, they take a step forward, their bodies immediately tense as drawn bowstrings. The swordsman takes a low guard, while his opponent hefts the long Danish-pattern axe and waits, analysing the swordsman's defence. Presumably he sees something, because he plunges forward and swings the axe around his head and down, pulling the swing a little to one side at the last moment. The bright, cannel-ground edge strikes the shield's rim but skids off, and the axe bites deep into the turf. Spotting an unexpected advantage, the swordsman pushes forward with his shield and pivots his right shoulder for a devastating diagonal cut.
"Hold it!"
grunts the axeman.
"Offside?"
The swordsman checks the stroke painfully in mid-air. "It was not," he protests. "Offside," the axeman repeats firmly.
"Look at where you've got your feet."
The swordsman glances down, tries to draw his left foot back.
"I saw that,"
the axeman says.
"All right,"
the swordsman sighs. "I suppose, technically..."
"Technically be buggered,"
the axeman interrupts.
"Offside is offside. Free hit to me."
"Yes,
all right,"
grunts the swordsman. "Though, if we're going to be all picky about it..." With a tremendous effort, the axeman heaves the axe out of the turf and swirls it round his head in a flashing arc, while his enemy stands perfectly still behind his ruined shield. The axe impacts on the rim, shearing through the steel band and deep into the timber, only just stopping short of the swordsman's left hand. In reply, the swordsman jerks the shield and the trapped axe head sideways, nearly disarming his opponent.
"You're doing it again,"
the axeman points out. "What?" Another quick glance. "Oh, it's not.
It's ever since they changed the LBS rule,"
the swordsman complains bitterly.
"I'd only just figured out what the old rule was, too." "There's nothing to figure out," the axeman says coldly. "Left foot no more than 5 inches in front of the shield boss, or it's a foul shot. Perfectly simple. A child of 4 could understand it."
"Yes, well..." The swordsman isn't happy, but he lets his left arm drop enough for the axeman to dislodge his blade.
"I can't see what was so bad about the old rule. If they'd only leave well alone and stop fiddling with it." "Another free hit to me," the axeman points out, with a smirk. "You aren't doing terribly well so far, are you?"
The swordsman grins back at him.
"Given that you've had 6 free hits and I'm still standing," he says, "looks like I'm not the only one. If you ask me, you are trying to hit too hard. Relax, loosen up, let the axe do the work instead of trying to force it."
The axeman pulls a face and tries again. This time, perhaps because he's tired and irritated, he manages to miss completely. The swordsman sniggers.
"While we're on the subject of rules,"
the axeman replies, tugging his blade out of the turf once more and stepping back into a defensive backguard.
"what about Rule 46, Section 3? No unnecessary talking."
"That's a bit rich coming from you," says the swordsman huffily.
"Talk about your pot and kettle."
Before he can finish his sentence, the axeman swings again, bending his knees and drawing the stroke very low as he aims for the swordsman's ankles. But the swordsman reads the cut perfectly and jumps high in the air from a standstill so that the blade passes harmlessly under his feet. As he lands, one foot jams the axe shaft down, ripping it out of the other man's hands. Almost before the swordsman gets his balance, he swings. The axeman rears away, arching his back, and just manages to avoid the sword blade, but the sudden violent effort unbalances him. He seems to hang in the air for a moment, both hands waving helplessly, before crashing down on his back. As soon as he's down, the swordsman cuts again. The axeman wriggles sideways, almost but not quite far enough, as the very tip of the blade engraves a line across his forehead, about an inch above eye level. And on a double wound score, too, the swordsman gloats.
"Now then." "Just a minute," sighs the axeman. "You haven't a clue, have you?"
The swordsman scowls horribly, but stays put. "Now what?"
"Rule 27, replies the axeman smugly. "Section 14.
"Gotcha," he adds. The swordsman's eyebrows bunch together like huddling sheep.
"Remind me,"
he growls.
"With pleasure." "The back foot rule."
"Oh."
"Exactly. When making an offensive stroke at a fallen or unbalanced opponent, the back foot must be in contact with the ground at all times. The ground, please note, not the other bloke's axe handle. He smiles unpleasantly. Another free hit to me. The swordsman clicks his tongue. Get on with it then, he mutters, and this time don't bunch your shoulders together like that. You want to be careful you don't chop your own foot off. With a scowl that curdled mercury, the axeman starts to get to his feet. Hang on, the swordsman objects. Just what you think you're doing. What does it look like? The swordsman beams like the sunrise. Rule 17, he says. Section 8. All free hits must be taken from the position the striker is in when the foul shot occurred. He licks his lips. Free hit to me, he adds cheerfully. It doesn't say that. Yes, it does. Doesn't it? It does. The swordsman's face is a study in baffled rage. Are you calling me a liar or something? The axeman nods. Yes, he says. You take that back or I'll smash your face in. Oh, that's... The swordsman adds. The axeman chuckles and slowly gets to his feet. Supervening fresh challenge, the axeman says cheerfully. Rule 92. The current bout is declared null and void. Start all over again. The swordsman makes a growling noise. You did that on purpose, he mutters. Tricked me into a fresh challenge? Yes, the axeman agrees. Perfectly legal, he adds. You can check if you like. When you're ready, grunts the swordsman, icily polite. His opponent retrieves his axe, spits on his hands. In your own time, he replies. For a moment the swordsman hesitates, then he darts sideways, feinting a lunge to the other man's left knee, converting it effortlessly into a rising backhand slash. The axeman parries just in time with the axe handle, but the swordsman's blade slices it neatly in two, leaving his enemy gripping 18 inches of headless shaft. Before the axeman can move or cite Rule 38, the swordsman rocks back on his heels and lunges again, and thrusts his sword deep into a thick patch of swirling grey mist, which instantly dissolves. Oh, for crying out loud, the swordsman yells. That's cheating! The last few wisps of mist wriggle like maggots in the air and glow briefly with yellow-gold fire, spelling out the words, So report me, in 12-inch runes. The swordsman throws his sword on the ground and jumps on it. Then he frowns, stoops down, and picks up a handful of fine-grained dirt, which he tosses into the air where the letters had appeared. The dirt flares vividly into sparkling light, revealing the outline of a door or gateway, complete with lintel, hinges, and big round doorknob. Right, the doorman grunts. Sheathing his sword, he reaches out, grabs the outline of the doorknob, and twists it sharply a quarter turn, and vanishes, never to be seen in this timeline again. Paul Carpenter was dragged out of a singularly nasty dream, in which he was being chased through a thick bramble-draped forest by the teddy bear he'd owned when he was 6, by a knock on the door. He sat up, opened his eyes, and realised that he'd fallen asleep in his chair in front of the TV. That in itself was hardly surprising, since there's never anything good on in the summer. Who, on the other hand, would want to pay him a visit at this time of night? Paul scrabbled for the remote, hit the standby button, and stood up. There it was again, knuckles on the woodwork. He'd had the television sound turned right down so it couldn't be upstairs complaining about the noise, and door-to-door salesmen rarely wasted their energy trudging up the 4 flights of badly lit stairs. As he opened the door with his right hand, he pinched sleep out of his eyes with his left. "Hello," said a familiar voice. "Uncle Ken." "I know that. Can I come in?" The yawn got past Paul's defences and escaped before he could do anything about it, but Uncle Ken wasn't the sort to be offended by yawns, or indeed anything that didn't actually draw blood. He ducked under Paul's arm, no great feat for a man of his minimal stature, and scuttled like a startled lizard into the living room. By the time Paul caught up with him, he'd poured himself a large glass of the fine malt whisky that Paul had been given for his birthday 2 years ago, and was sitting in the only comfortable chair. Paul slumped a little and perched on the other one. "I didn't know you were in town, Uncle Ken," he said. "I guessed as much," Uncle Ken replied. "Otherwise you'd have locked up your booze and put the chain on the door. Got any corned beef?" Corned beef? Paul thought about that for a moment and shook his head. Not to worry. Anything'll do, cheese or ham or tongue. Don't too much butter on the bread. And a bit of fruit would go down nicely." Paul smiled grimly, went into the kitchen and made 2 rounds of industrial chicken sandwiches. On the side of the plate he perched the apple he'd been saving for tomorrow. And then, to save himself another trip, he opened the fridge. "Sod it," he said to himself, the little light's gone on the blink again, and took out the very last can of beer. "Cheers," Uncle Ken said, pulling the ring with his usual surprising grace.
5'0" in his cowboy boots, sausage-fingered and practically circular, Uncle Ken nevertheless managed to do even the simplest thing with the elegant poise of a geisha pouring tea. "You not having anything?" Paul shook his head. So, he said, trying to sound cheerful, have you got a gig in these parts or something?" "No such luck, son," Uncle Ken replied with his mouth full. Paul had known what the answer to this question was likely to be before he asked it. For the last 20 years, Uncle Ken had been pecking out a sparse living, doing stand-up comedy in obscure, short-lived clubs and bars up and down the country, with occasional enforced sabbaticals in the construction, catering and retail petrol industries. Ironic, really. Paul's mum had chosen him to be her only son's godfather because at that time he'd been an ineffably respectable actuary, and because he was the most boring man she'd ever met. Whether it was the strain of turning up at Paul's christening and forking out for a small imitation pewter tankard that had pushed Uncle Ken over the edge into the nomadic life he now pursued, Paul had no idea. He hadn't lost much sleep over it. Watching someone else eat the food you'd hope would tide you over till payday isn't the most fun you can have with the lights on, and Paul couldn't help feeling slightly annoyed. But being small-minded about it wouldn't bring his bread and sliced chicken back, so he dredged up a small smile from somewhere and asked politely after his godfather's health and general well-being. "Not so hot," Uncle Ken replied. "Did 3 nights in Peterborough in January. Went over very nicely. Not a huge crowd. Probably the venue getting flooded out by a burst sewer the week before didn't help. Joined up with an experimental performance arts collective for a bit. Interesting bunch. There was a bloke who welded bits of angle iron while his girlfriend sang medieval plain song and played the zither. And another girl who juggled with razor blades stuck into apples. She left the group at Redcar. And a couple of those living statue blokes. Only they were so good the audience never figured out they weren't real. And a lad who did barefoot tightrope walking on an electric fence. And me, of course. We were planning to take the show all over to Canada for the Saskatchewan Arts Festival. But we couldn't afford the fare. How about you?" Paul grinned. "Oh, nothing exciting," he said. "Last I heard, you were just about to start a new job." Paul nodded. "That's right. Been there 9 months now." "Liking it?" "Not a lot." Uncle Ken shrugged. "Pack it in then. You're young, no ties. Find something you really want to do and do it, like I did." Paul shook his head slowly. "Nice idea," he said, "but I can't." "Can't find anything you like doing?" "I can't quit. Long story," he added, stifling another yawn. "But the bottom line is, I'm stuck there for the foreseeable future. Bummer, but there it is." Uncle Ken frowned. "That's no kind of an attitude," he said. "I was the same when I was your age. I just finished college, got my qualifications. People had expectations I had to live up to, all that crap. Just meant I wasted the best years of my life, doing a stupid rotten job I hated. You want to get out there, have adventures, strange new worlds and all." Paul laughed like a dry stick breaking. "Oh, there's plenty of that kind of thing where I'm working now," he said. "It's the adventures and the strange new worlds that are the problem, not the mindless tedium and stuff. I can handle mindless tedium. It's..." He stopped and then shook his head. "You don't want to hear about that," he said. "So, tell me, this girl who juggled the apples..." "You can tell me about it if you want to." Yes, but I don't." "Did she wear gloves, or did she have particularly hard skin on her hands, or what?" "Yes, you do." "No, I don't." Uncle Ken was giving Paul a stern look from behind his enormously thick spectacle lenses. Seen from the wrong angle, they made his eyes look like huge, hard-boiled eggs. "I've known you since before you were born," he said. "And there's something you want to tell someone about, but you're hesitating because you think it'll sound stupid, or I won't believe it, or something. I'm right, aren't I?" "Yes," Paul confessed, "but you don't want to hear about it. Really, trust me." "Bollocks." Uncle Ken poured himself another glass of whiskey and rolled an extremely thin cigarette. "I'm a very good listener, me." "Yes, but you don't want..." "Yes, I do." "No, you..." Paul stopped and thought for a moment. "All right," he said. "Stop me when you're prepared to admit I was right, which won't take long. And if you're going to smoke in here..." "Get on with it." So Paul told him all about it, how he'd got a job as a junior clerk with a firm called J.W. Wells & Co. in the city, without knowing what it was he actually did. How it had come as rather a shock to him when he found out that they were one of the top 6 firms of family and commercial magicians in the UK, specialising in the entertainment and media, mining and mineral resources, construction, dispute resolution, applied sorcery and pest control sectors. How he'd almost immediately tried to resign, and how he'd found out a little while later that the reason why they wouldn't let him was that his parents had financed their early retirement to Florida by selling him to the partners of J.W, who wanted him because the knack of doing magic ran in his family to such an extent that it was inevitable that he'd have it too. How he'd briefly found true love with Sophie, the other junior clerk, shortly before she was abducted by Contessa Judy di Castelbianco, the firm's entertainment and PR partner and hereditary queen of the Fae, who permanently erased Sophie's feelings for Paul from her mind. How he'd learned scrying for mineral deposits from Mr. Tanner, who was half goblin on his mother's side, and heroism and dragon slaying from Ricky Wormtorter, the pest control partner, and a bit of applied sorcery from the younger Mr. Wells, before the elder Mr. Wells turned him into a photocopier, and how he'd just started learning spatio-temporal displacement theory with Theodorus van Spee, former professor of classical witchcraft at the University of Leiden, and inventor of the portable folding parking space. Oh, and how he died. Twice. Only the second time was an accident, and been put on deposit for a while in the firm's account at the Bank of the Dead. "Told you," Paul said, but he wouldn't listen. Uncle Ken's eyebrows had risen so high that they'd popped up above the rim of his glasses, like hairy slugs surfing a really high wave. "All right," he said. "I'm surprised, I'll give you that." "Surprised," Paul repeated. Uncle Ken nodded, and a bit disappointed. He said, "I thought I'd talked your dad out of that idea when you were born. Not fair on the lad, I told him. Just because he can do all that stuff doesn't necessarily follow that he'll want to. But to be honest with you, I never did trust him much." Over the last 9 months, Paul thought he'd more or less lost the knack of being shocked. You knew?" "Of course I knew. It's not exactly a secret in your family." He scowled. "Only I suppose your dad kept quiet about it, if he was planning to tell you all along. What you don't know, you can't get bolshy about. But I could have told him you wouldn't like it. All down to temperament, see? I mean, obviously you'd have the talent, with your Uncle Ernie being, about your Uncle Ernie." Paul nodded. "Oh, yes," he said. "I know all about him." "Well, there you are, then. He was all right, actually, until just before the end. He'd have been proud to think you were carrying on in the tradition." Paul shook his head. "No, he's not. He doesn't like me very much. Mind you, it's my fault he's stranded forever in the vaults of the Bank of the Dead, so I suppose he's got grounds for being all snotty about it. But for crying out loud, Uncle Ken, you might have told me." Uncle Ken shrugged. "Not my place to interfere," he said. "Your mum would have never forgiven me. Anyhow, would you believe me if I'd have told you?" "Yes, but," Paul sighed and slumped back in his chair. "A bad idea, since there wasn't much holding it together apart from force of habit. It just really pisses me off," he said. "Everybody in the whole world turning out to know all about this magic thing apart from me. And nobody telling me," he added bitterly. "The first I knew about it was when I stayed late in the office one night and nearly got eaten alive by goblins." "No chance of that," Uncle Ken said, shaking his head gravely. "Contrary to what you hear, they're mostly not dangerous unless you provoke them, and—" "Yes," Paul snapped, "I know. Apparently I'm part goblin myself, and they hardly ever eat family. It would have been nice if someone had prepared me for that particular revelation. Just a bit. Not that I've got anything against them particularly. Well, that's not true. They scare the shit out of me. But so do most things in life. But even so—" "Never mind about that," Uncle Ken said quickly. "Tell me more about this bird of yours. Sophie, was it?" "Bird," thought Paul. "Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert." "Well, she isn't any longer," he said sharply. "I told you. Countess Judy scrubbed all of that out of her mind, and now it won't come back. So that's that," he said, trying to sound brave. It's a real bitch, because we still have to work together, and she can't quit either. Another judicious purchase by the partners, you see." Uncle Ken nodded slowly. "Always was your trouble," he said. "Falling in love with anything that stays still long enough. Kills," he went on, "it's not real. It's because you know nothing's ever going to come of it. You know that as soon as you start getting obvious, they always burst out laughing or tell you to get lost. So it's safe." "All right," he added with a grin. "You're going to tell me it wasn't like that this time." Paul had gone a deep beetroot colour. "Actually," he said, it was going just fine till Countess Judy ruined everything. I mean, we'd moved in together. We were making plans for the future." "Bloody hell," Uncle Ken interrupted. "No wonder you were scared." I was not scared." Well, of course he'd been scared. More so, in fact, than when Ricky Wormtorter had pointed the crossbow at his heart and pressed the trigger and killed him. It was wonderful. We really loved each other, and then... "And then, at the very last minute, you escaped." Uncle Ken raised a hand before Paul could interrupt or find something to use as a weapon.
Didn't seem like that at the time, I know. Hurt like buggery, I'm sure. Probably you felt just like shit quiche in a bed of wild rice. But really, deep down, you knew you'd got out just in time, before the roof caved in. You can't kid me, son. I've known you too long. It wasn't like that. Why did it matter so much that Uncle Ken wouldn't believe him? It wasn't like that at all. I didn't want it to end. I'd have done anything. There must have been something in his voice, like a tiny drop of blood in shark-infested water. Uncle Ken smiled faintly. But you didn't, did you? I couldn't. It wouldn't have been... How do you know about it anyway? I don't. But you're just about to tell me. Paul gave in. It was after we'd rescued her, he said, and she realised what that evil bitch had done to her. J.W. made this thing called a love filter. You drink it and you fall in love with the first person you see. Cast iron guaranteed. They've been selling it for 200 years and it's never failed. She offered to drink it, so things would be back to how they were. But I said no. You said no. Oh, I see. Because it wouldn't have been real, Paul protested. It had been as though I'd snuck up when she wasn't looking and spiked her coffee with it or something. You'd have done anything, Uncle Ken said slowly, only you didn't. You were a chicken standing on the conveyor belt, looking straight at the plucking machine, and suddenly the power goes off. You weren't about to go jumping up saying you got 50p for the meter. Admit it, Paul. That's exactly how it was. Paul shook his head. You're right, he said. About how I used to be, but it was different with Sophie, and now... Uncle Ken laughed out loud. And now you've got a bloody wonderful excuse. You've got a note from God saying you're let off PE forever. Believe me, it doesn't work like that. Next bird you see that doesn't look like a garden gnome with warts, it'll be the same old story all over again. Come on, Paul, be honest with yourself. Remember Mandy Bolsover? Paul winced. Uncle Ken, I was 14. You can't blame someone for Mandy Bolsover, Uncle Ken repeated. Big girl, captain of the shot put team. You spent a whole term drooping around like a poisoned goldfish. Then you wrote a suicide note and took 4 paracetamol. And you'd never said a single word to her. Paul gave him a look that would have stripped the Teflon off a space shuttle. Anyway, he said, it's not going to happen ever again. I've already seen to that, and I mean it, he added. Really? Oddly enough, that's exactly what I say every time I pack in smoking, Uncle Ken said sadly. I did really well the year before last, he added. I lasted 36 hours, 12 minutes and 14 seconds. The 14 seconds were because my lighter wouldn't work and I had to run to the kitchen for matches. But the 36 hours were sheer willpower. And no, Paul said, because finally I found a bit of the magic stuff that's actually useful for something other than making money for partners. Here, he added, opening a drawer and taking out a folded, dog-eared sheet of paper. Go on, take a look. Uncle Ken shrugged, took the paper and squinted at it over his glasses. What's this supposed to be then? It's a recipe, Paul replied. Or probably they'd call it a formula. But as far as I can see, it's just cooking. I photocopied it from one of Professor Van Spee's books. It's the opposite of the love filter thing. If you drink it every 6 months, you're guaranteed not to fall in love. For once, Uncle Ken seemed impressed. You're kidding. Absolutely not. And it's dead easy to make. All nice simple ingredients, apart from the creme fraiche, whatever that is. You can get that in Sainsbury's, Uncle Ken interrupted. Delia Smith bungs it in everything. Probably runs her car on it. What's this, though? 2 milligrams Van Spee's crystals. Oh, that. Paul looked away. Yes, that's a bit unusual. But Professor Van Spee's got a big jar of it in his desk drawer, and I think he invented it or something. Anyway, I sneaked in one time when I knew he wouldn't be there and, nicked some. Really? Weren't you afraid he'd notice? Actually, the thought hadn't occurred to Paul before. Nah, he said. It was a big jar, and I only took an aspirin bottleful, and it's been a week and he hasn't said anything. Oh, well, that's all right then. Uncle Ken pulled a face. And you're actually going to swallow this stuff? You bet. I've mixed up a batch, all except the creme thing, and apparently you had that last. Once the mixture's stood for at least a week, it's still got a day to go, so if I can get the creme, whatever it is, in the supermarket... You aren't worried it'll turn into frog or something? Paul shook his head. No chance of that, he said. Completely different sort of magic, turning people into things. And no, I don't know if the medicine's safe to drink because obviously I've never made it before. But as far as I'm concerned, it's well worth the risk. You were absolutely right about how I used to be, but I've had enough of all that crap, and this'll be the end of it. Uncle Ken stood up. "Where's the biscuit jar?" he said. "What?" "The biscuit jar." "I don't bother, I'll find it." Uncle Ken went into the kitchen and came back munching. "Fact is," he said, "I've been neglecting my duty as a godfather, looking after your moral and spiritual welfare and all that stuff. You need taking in hand, you do, before you make a right cow of your life." Paul looked him over, from his worn-out line dancing boots to his masking tape-bound spectacles, pausing midway at the bulge in his pocket where he'd helped himself generously to Paul's chocolate digestives. A right cow," he said. "Thanks, Uncle Ken. I'm sure that'd be a real help. Maybe if I get my act together and make a real effort, I get to be just like you." Uncle Ken shook his head. "You wish," he said, "but there's no harm in trying. You couldn't enter fiver, could you, just till the end of the week?" Paul paid up without a word, and Uncle Ken thanked him. "See," he added, "I've only been on the job 5 minutes and already I've made you a better human being. Talking of which, you wouldn't happen to have any spare socks you don't need for anything, only top drawer of the chest of drawers. Just help yourself," Paul said wearily. "Uncle Ken, I'm not sure I really want to be a better person after all. Can't I just stay a mess and—" After Uncle Ken had gone, Paul made himself some cheese on toast and did a quick stocktake in the kitchen cupboard. His first faltering steps along the road to self-improvement had cost him 2 packets of biscuits, a jar of instant coffee, the bag of sugar he'd just opened that morning, and a big tin of custard powder. Sending the inventory to the bedroom, he'd found he was morally and spiritually better off by the absence of 3 pairs of socks, 2 shirts, 3 pairs of pants, and his nail scissors. On the other hand, he'd somehow managed to acquire a Canadian 10-cent piece, which he found in the empty desert where once several pairs of socks had safely grazed, like the buffalo before Bill Cody came along. He looked at it for a moment, frowned, and dropped it back into the drawer. Creme fraiche, he thought. Sainsbury's. I'll stop off there on my way home from work tomorrow, and then that'll be that done, and one less thing to worry about. Wonder if they also sell lockable biscuit jars. The cheese on toast tasted of plastic and cardboard, and then Paul went to bed. On his bedside table was a book. It had been there for several days, and each night before groping for the light switch he had done his best to read a couple of pages, because Professor Vansby had told him that it was essential reading if he was to get the hang of the work they'd be doing over the next 3 months. Unfortunately, the book itself appeared to be an exceptionally powerful magical object, with the power to put to sleep anybody who so much as opened its covers. Time was getting on, and all he'd managed to do so far was read the first page and a half 6 times. Still didn't make any sense. "Let this visible world," he read for the 7th time, "be a biscuit, above the immeasurable span of time, below the limitless possibility of space, sandwiched between them the custard filling of elsewhere and elsewhen. The world is in haste and rushes to its end. The world is narrow and tapers headlong through entropy towards the sharp point where the angels dance. Only in the eye of the storm, through which a camel cannot pass into the kingdom of heaven, is there room to manoeuvre, time to reflect, a remote possibility of doubt. Only in philosophy is there a keyhole in the door of the future, through which one can spy on yesterday. It is our business, therefore, to find room for a fingernail between the upper and the lower inevitabilities, so that they can be prized apart, if only for a little while. To this end, let us consider that all things are formed out of the 5 elements, earth, air, fire, water." Paul yawned. Sheer, unmitigated doggy-poo, he reflected, and fell asleep. Not so much fell, glided like a leaf drifting down from a tree on a still day, and when Paul reached the ground he was standing beside a single-track road on a bleak moor. On the other side of the road the ground sloped sharply away to jagged bleak rocks and an angry steel-grey sea. Off in the distance he could hear the scream of many powerful engines revving high and changing gear. A seagull wheeled overhead and changed course when it saw him. He wasn't alone. A small round man with a bald head and glasses was standing next to him, but either he hadn't seen him or he was pretending. Paul was sure that he knew who it was, but it was as though the man had control over that part of Paul's brain that dealt with recognition, and he wasn't allowing him to fit a name to the face. Fair enough, Paul could take a hint. He looked away for a moment, the way you do, and when he turned back, the man had vanished. Then he saw someone walking towards him, and it was just as well he knew that this was only a dream brought on by stale cheese untimely eaten, because otherwise he'd have been distinctly nervous about the stranger.
He was tall and huge, with fiery red hair that stuck out from his head in all directions, like a dandelion duck. He was wrapped in a damp cloak or blanket, and in his right hand he held a sword. Paul groaned. He'd gone off swords ever since the time when he'd had to share his somewhat cramped living quarters with a huge sword and a stone, an unexplained and unsolicited gift from old Mr. Wells. It had turned out to be a magical key, and he'd managed to get rid of it eventually, but not before he'd cut himself several times and pulled a muscle in his back trying to get the thing out through the door on his own. After that, as far as Paul was concerned, swords meant trouble. Horrible J.W.based intrusions of weirdness into his free time, which he could well do without. But the man walked straight up to him, just as it began to rain. "Here," he said in a strong foreign accent, "you're getting wet. Take this." Whereupon he swung the sword high above his head, flipped a catch or pressed a button or something, and opened the sword out to a perfectly normal golf umbrella. Paul thanked him, but the man walked away without looking back, and then the mist closed around him and he was gone. Never mind, it was better than getting wet. The engine sounded very close now, and Paul peered down the road to see. There was someone beside him, looking over his shoulder. She had long brown hair, slightly frizzy with golden streaks in it, so light they were almost silver. "I'll give you 5-1 on the Kawasaki," she said, and for some reason he shook his head and replied it had to be the Norton, and it'd be outright theft to take her money. Then 9 motorcycles rolled past them, each rider waving as they went by, to the girl, not to Paul. He saw their hair floating in the slipstream as they passed, and the girl next to him pointed out that he owed her £5. "Sorry," he said, "but I gave my last fiver to Uncle Ken." Oh, that seemed to be an acceptable reason for not paying. "Well, anyway," she said, "best be getting back before anybody notices we've gone." Paul hadn't looked around at any point, so he hadn't seen her face. It was rather important that he didn't, in fact, and he felt vaguely proud of himself for resisting the temptation to peek. Her voice was cold and hard, which more than made up for the fact, he had no idea how he knew this, that she was very beautiful and had freckled shoulders to die for. Great, he told himself, the medicine works. Wait till I tell Sophie. And there she was, right in front of him, her hair plastered to her head by the rain, looking small and thin and very, very wet. "For crying out loud, Paul," she said, very deliberately, not noticing the redhead standing next to him. "Do you realise we're 20 minutes late? Now come on." He followed her up a steep hillside towards a ruined tower overlooking a misty grey creek where 2 small wooden ships lay at anchor. "This is the last time I come looking for you," she went on as they dragged up a winding narrow stone staircase. The steps were worn and slippery, and the only light was a grey blur around the edges of arrow slits. "And I'm really, really tired of covering up for you just because you're too bloody idle to do your reading assignments." "I'm sorry," Paul mumbled, "but every time I open the stupid book it sends me straight to sleep." She sighed. "You clown," she said. "It's supposed to. Now pay attention." Then it all burst around him like a flood. So many things he suddenly knew how to do, so many answers and explanations, everything that had been puzzling and bewildering him and driving him to distraction and despair since he'd first joined JWW. All those things that everybody else seemed to know except him, and he really hated that. It was like standing directly under a huge volcano as it burst into furious life, belching out fire and enlightenment and useful practical information, formulae, specifications, procedures, detailed recipes, easy to follow step-by-step instructions, and a huge cloud of yellow ash that blotted out the sun, as though God had perched a bag of custard powder on top of the door of infinity as a practical joke, and it had landed kersplat on top of his head. Meanwhile, Sophie was yelling, "The creme fraiche! Don't forget the creme fraiche!" And then Paul woke up.